Overlord Volume 1 The Undead King. This is the first light novel in the bizarre mix of dark comedy and power fantasy that is the Overlord series, and this is quite an intriguing start that to me reads quite differently from its anime counterpart. Overlord light novels are very dense. Bone Daddy likes to drink his milk, or I don't know where I'm going with this metaphor, but the point is there is a lot to unpack here, so let's get right into it, starting off as usual with the illustrations. Let's start with the obvious. Overlord's art is gorgeous and very to the point that these are the baddies. If they look evil, it's because they are evil. I will say as a nitpick, my only criticism of Sobine's art is that these covers can get very busy. This one, for example, there is a lot going on here, and sometimes on the printed version of the book, the darker tones may not come out as knitted as they should be. I noticed, for example, there is quite a difference between what I can see in this book and the digital cover. Still, the cover is gorgeous and unbelievably hype. You grab this and you immediately think, wow, who is this evil-looking fellow and what is happening here? Much like Nazarick, the cover itself really exudes the villain aesthetic from the front to the back to everything in between really, and it's not every book that uses the tagline "The world is all yours," so you know you're strapping in for a ride. This is a hardcover book, and it also comes with these beautiful unfoldable pages which on one side have the Great Tomb of Nazarick, which for a first time reader or for someone coming back into the series is very useful to try and make sense of all of this, and you can see how much thought was put into this, because even from the map you can see this place is pretty large. And on the other side we have this amazing image of Ainz and the NPCs, which is once again very good for someone new coming into this series to know what their characters look like, but most importantly this image also really depicts the characters' personalities. You have Demiurge with his scheming smile, you have Aura sticking her tongue out playfully towards Shaltir, who looks very annoyed, you have Mare looking very awkward at all of this, you have Sebas, very straight and perfect and elegant, you have Albedo with a tender smile she reserves only for Ainz, and you have Kokyutos looking big and jacked and intimidating, a huge bug just almost spilling out of the frame, and of course at the center you have Ainz looking kingly in the middle of all of this. At the end of the book we also have these stat pages, which I love. It really helps the reader get immersed in the video game aspect of Overlord, and for stat nerds who love to see numbers, this will tingle them where they like to be tingled. Besides that, it is also worth mentioning that unlike ReZero or Faraway Paladin, for example, the images scattered throughout the book are in color, which is always appreciated and also one of the reasons why these light novels are more expensive than the other ones I mentioned. Now, getting into the characters, let's first talk about, of course, the man of the hour, the main character, the man of many names, Ainz, also known as Momonga, also known as Suzuki Satoru, or as friends like to call him, Bone Daddy or Papa Bones. And I want to make a distinction here between Ainz and Suzuki Satoru, because Satoru's characterization is to me the biggest difference and perhaps the biggest highlight of going from the anime into the light novel. In the anime, Volume 1 was adapted into 4 episodes, and the written medium lends itself way more at exploring a character's inner thoughts, so I think that the idea that an anime only has of Satoru may be a bit different from someone who read the light novel. Whereas in the anime, the final moments before the game shut down felt relatively inconsequential and merely a setup to the beginning of the story, here in the light novel they feel very meaningful. Our main character goes into almost exhaustive detail of how much work and passion he and his guildmates put into this guild, and through this first chapter we can see his deep attachment to Nazarick, just how much this means to him, and that helps put into context a lot of decisions that Ainz makes throughout the story. Satoru in real life is kind of a loser. He doesn't really have a family, doesn't really have friends. According to what he says, he's not even particularly good at his job. Yggdrasil the game is more than just a hobby in which Satoru spends ridiculous amounts of money on. It's where his social life is, it's where his friends are, it's where he spends most of his free time. In many ways, the game is what pushes him through, what gives meaning to his life, and what pushes him through his very dull existence. So when his guildmates stop playing due to real life enough responsibilities, here it cuts deeper because we know that Satoru doesn't have anything else. In the final moments of the game, when he's by himself as the only player left in Nazarick, there's a true feeling of loneliness and sadness that to me the anime did not manage to convey. Yes, even in the first chapter there's a bit of comedy sprinkled in with, for example, Albedo's backstory, but the chapter is an emotionally charged one that really makes the reader connect to Satoru as a person. We feel his loneliness, we feel his disappointment at none of his friends staying with him until the end, we feel his desperation in maintaining the guild by himself and holding on desperately to the only thing he has left. And when he realizes that he's in another world, he isn't particularly eager to want to go back, and honestly, who would blame him? He is, however, very motivated to find his friends, and that makes total sense with his character. If you're a fan of Overlord from the anime, I think it's worth reading the light novel even if it's just by the first chapter alone, as to me the characterization is just so good. Not spoiling anything for future volumes, but there's this constant blur of where Satoru ends and where Ainz begins, and upon rereading this volume, I noticed that Satoru himself carries some of Ainz's features. Like they say in pro wrestling, Ainz is Satoru's gimmick. He's not a different character, he's just himself turned up to 11. There's a moment, for example, when he gets very angry at his guildmates for not staying with him until the end. "Don't F with me," he roared, pounding the table with both fists. "This is the great tomb of Nazarick. We built it together. How could you all abandon it so easily?" But despite having this very emotional outburst, he very quickly realizes that he's in the wrong and his guildmates just did the natural thing. And I thought this was very interesting because it's very similar to Ainz's own emotional regulation. Satoru has every right to be angry perhaps, and yes, it is a bit pathetic to be raging inside a video game. Me personally, I'm a mature adult. I would never do such a thing. But here he is very quick to check himself, and so I think that's interesting because even if he doesn't notice it, he is similar to Ainz in that aspect. He may not be the unparalleled genius that the NPCs think that he is, or that he almost has this expectation of being for them, but he is someone who is very calculated and very quick to check himself, and he does not let emotion take over. Even in his own descriptions as leader of the guild, he always seems very self-deprecating, but I think there is a reason as to why he's the leader of Ainz. He may not have 9000 IQ, or at least the human Satoru doesn't, maybe Ainz does, but he is very rational and he always tries to make the best decision possible for his guild, sometimes even at his own expense, and that makes him a very effective leader, something that I think the NPCs also value. Yes, storyline-wise, the NPCs revere him because he's a supreme one, but I also think they really like that he's so dedicated and the only one who stayed behind, the only one left that is faithful to the guild. Even though Satoru's persona is mostly used throughout the series for comedic effect, I like this tension between his idea of who he is, his idea of who Ainz is supposed to be, and who he himself is, which is somewhere in the middle. One last thing I want to note about our main character is that despite being an evil overlord, he is still a player at heart, and that means he wants to get in on the action even if it's not always the smartest choice. With the evil overlord theme, we could get a very hands-off protagonist who just made his evil schemes behind the scenes, and for example here in this very volume, in the climax in the Battle of Karn, he didn't need to go himself. He could have sent one of the many overpowered NPCs at his disposal, especially because at that time he didn't even have a full grasp of what his spells did, and yet he went himself because at heart he is still a player and he wants to get in there. Obviously he won't make any decision that's stupid, he will always take the necessary precautions, but we will see this throughout the story that he constantly wants to dive in head first and get involved with things by himself. Ainz has a certain pride as guildmaster, and he's not reckless, but he's also not risk averse. He's the type of guy who will go right up to your face and say, "Your girl calls me Bone Daddy." As far as the story goes, Volume 1 has the really tough task of being the building block for the story, introducing this large cast of characters, plus a magic system, plus the world building, all while being entertaining, and I think it did a good job. Satoru's comedic use as a straight man to everything around him, sometimes including himself, is a nice way to keep the info dumps flowing and not get too boring. I will say though, Overlord is the type of series that is tailor-made for fans of video games, especially MMOs and RPGs, and this can be both a positive and a negative. The explanation of game mechanics can be pretty cool for people that like that type of thing, especially the slight nuances of how the spells come from the video game but have slightly different effects in this world. For example, how the Death Knight spell works in the game and how it can work here when he uses a body. The multitude of small little nerdy details really make this world feel super fleshed out and super thought out. You can see the writer's passion through the writing, even if it can be a bit exhaustive. Because yes, sometimes the verbose descriptions of world building and magic spells can really go into word salad territory where the narrator just yaps and you act like you're supposed to know what he's talking about. Like, for example, just take a look at this wall of text here. Race of Overlord had the following monster powers: create upper tier undead, create middle tier undead, create lower tier undead, negative touch, Aura of Despair 5, negative guard, dark soul, raven black halo, immortal blessing, impure providence, black wisdom. There's a racial joke in here somewhere. You see what I mean? This is a bit much. The author's passion is good, but it can sometimes get a bit overboard, and it seems like you stopped reading a book and you are now reading some sort of video game guide. This is a bit much, especially because Overlord as a series likes to reference things that it explains only further ahead, and this can be a bit overwhelming for first-time readers. For example, in this book they mention world items, or excuse me, one do item. They mention this, and me personally, I know what it is because I've read the series, but for a first-time reader it can be a bit confusing with all of this mishmash of concepts. As a whole, I think that the lore dump in video game lingo is manageable and is part of Overlord's nerdy charm. It's a feature, not a bug. However, it can be a bit much for someone reading for the first time. I also want to mention the secondary characters, specifically the NPCs of Nazarick, and I love that this cast is just so eccentric, is one word to put it, because at the exception of maybe Sebas, these guys are all lunatics, and watching them interact with each other made me chuckle multiple times. I love the tiny bits of backstory where Ainz says they are similar to their creators, and I love that they're all so different, because even if they have the same goal of serving Papa Bones, you can see that their ideas of what serving him means can be a bit different. And much like the whiplash between Satoru's personality and Ainz's perceived personality, I think it's hilarious how the NPCs act around him, especially for example Albedo. I think it's very funny how she's super dignified in work mode, but she's completely unhinged whenever the topic shifts to having Ainz's babies or whatever she's on. In particular, I want to highlight that these NPCs are each one crazier than the other, and some lines of dialogue, especially if you're reading for the first time, just make you do a double take. Like for example when Shaltir all of a sudden just says that she's wet. She's what? True vampire, more like true pervert. Who asked? And speaking of things nobody asked, I'm Team Albedo, just so you know. The dynamic with Albedo is particularly funny because it combines Satoru's natural awkwardness with the fact that he's remorseful at, in his mind, corrupting the creation of his friend. This creates a very funny dynamic where Ainz sort of wants to keep his distance and feels sort of guilty, while Albedo just wants to get on top of him and do some close combat PvP. The NPC's blind dedication to Ainz is a running joke that keeps getting better and better, and as you can see by the end of this book, our favorite skeleton has now put forward a plan in motion that will make him conquer the world, which seems fun. For people that want to get into Overlord and aren't sure if they're going to like it, I think that Volume 1 is definitely a good place to start and a good representation of what the series is all about. You get introduced to our main character and the main running joke that is the difference between who he is and the dark, majestic Overlord that he effectively roleplays. You also get introduced to our eccentric array of side characters who love their Overlord, going from looking up to him with deep admiration to wanting to carry his babies, which they never quite explain how that would work since he's a skeleton. But these people are freaks and he's called Papa Bones for a reason. The climax of this volume also gives you a first taste of why our main character is said to be overpowered and why it's so entertaining. Turns out that having an evil lich stomp arrogant weaklings is quite fun to read. The story for Volume 1 isn't quite as self-contained as Volume 1 for Faraway Paladin, for example, as Overlord loves to tease and reference and name drop future things for future books. But this can be a good thing as you get curious as to where the story is going and who are all these characters that were mentioned. By stretching the lore beyond the confines of this volume, it makes the world feel bigger and more alive. But I will say that for those who want to take a shot and aren't sure if they're ready for a series with over 10 volumes, despite Volume 1 having a ton of foreshadowing, it can be read as a self-contained story. Even if the story isn't finished, this initial story arc can be satisfying on its own. To me, the highlight of this volume is definitely Satoru's characterization, even if the rest of the stuff is also super fun. This right here to me is the building block of Overlord, and is also super impressive how the author manages to get the reader to be sympathetic by what is effectively an evil lich that wants to conquer the world. Once again, this volume is super dense, there's a lot to cover here. I didn't even mention the human characters, but I want to keep this video not super long as well, so if you haven't read Volume 1 yet, be sure to check it out. And if you have read Overlord Volume 1, then what did you think about it? Leave it in the comments below. And for those of you that are going to ask me, Dio, are you going to cover the Overlord series as well, just like you did with ReZero and Faraway Paladin? And the answer is probably yes. I cannot make promises because I may be hit by a bus, or maybe struck by lightning, or maybe both at the same time, which sounds painful. But I hopefully will cover this series while I still have my youthful vigor, since I'm getting old and my back hurts. And anyway, like, subscribe, the good stuff. Ciao.